Carl Denton was the kind of man nobody looked twice at. A quiet handyman, a friendly neighbor, the person people trusted with their broken fences and leaky roofs. Nathan, Marissa, and Eric were the names the town couldn't forget. The teenager, the nursing student, and the delivery driver who vanished without a trace. What no one realized was that their lives and their deaths were bound together inside a shed so ordinary that even police once stood inside it, never knowing they were standing above a hidden chamber of horror. The small town had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names, and where trouble seemed far away. That sense of safety shattered slowly, almost quietly, over the span of a single year. It began with the disappearance of a boy named Nathan. He was only 16, a high school football player who had walked home from practice one evening in late autumn. His cleats were found abandoned in the locker room and his backpack turned up in the grass near the school's parking lot. But Nathan himself was gone. At first, police suggested he may have run away. His family argued otherwise. He had no money, no car, and no reason to vanish into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and the search efforts brought no answers. The boy's photograph lingered on posters taped to lampposts, slowly fading in the sun. By spring, the unease had grown into something heavier. When a 22-year-old nursing student named Marissa failed to return home from her night shift at the county hospital, people started connecting dots. Her car was later found parked neatly in a lot a few blocks from her workplace, keys still inside, phone left on the passenger seat. Investigators searched nearby alleys, drainage ditches, and empty buildings. But there were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood. It was as though she had simply stepped out of her car and vanished into the air. The community began to whisper. It was harder to call it coincidence now. Two people missing, both young, both healthy, both with no reason to disappear. Summer brought the third case. A delivery driver named Eric stopped at a gas station before making his last scheduled drop-off for the night. He called his wife to say he would be home in half an hour. When morning came and he still hadn't returned, she reported him missing. His truck was discovered on a dirt road outside of town, door open, headlights still on, as if he had stepped out for a moment and never come back. No money had been stolen, nothing in the truck was disturbed. Authorities set up roadblocks and combed nearby woods with dogs, but once again the trail ended as abruptly as it began. By now, fear was gripping the town. Families no longer let their children walk alone after dark. Women carried pepper spray in their purses. Locks were checked twice before bed. The police issued statements urging calm, but they had nothing concrete to reassure the public. Rumors spread faster than official reports. Some believed a drifter was hunting locals. Others thought it was the work of someone they all knew, someone hiding in plain sight. The strangest part was how clean each disappearance seemed. No fights, no witnesses, no sounds in the night. It was almost surgical, as though whoever was behind it knew exactly how to erase their presence. What residents didn't know was that each victim had been drawn, unknowingly, to the same remote property. A piece of land on the edge of town, quiet and ordinary to anyone passing by, but hiding the first threads of a nightmare that was only just beginning. Carl Denton lived in plain sight, and that was what made him so dangerous. To the people in town, he was nothing more than the man you called when your fence leaned after a storm or when the mower blade wouldn't start. He never charged much, never complained, and often worked longer hours than anyone else thought necessary. He came across as humble, even shy, never raising his voice and never drawing attention. His neighbors remembered him for carrying groceries for the elderly or offering to shovel snow from the church steps before service. Nobody saw him as a threat, which was exactly how he wanted it. His property sat at the far edge of town, where farmland blurred into patches of forest. The house itself was small, a faded white cottage with shutters that needed paint. Behind it stood the shed, a structure larger than the home it belonged to. Bright red siding made it look cheerful, like something lifted from a farm supply catalog. Children riding their bikes past would see it shining against the tree line and think nothing of it. Inside, however, was no ordinary workshop. Over the years, Carl had poured his energy into transforming it into a place nobody else would ever truly understand. The shed was organized with precision. Tools hung neatly on hooks, each outlined in marker to show where it belonged. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with cans of paint, boxes of nails, and lengths of rope. To anyone who peeked inside, it appeared to be the workspace of a dedicated handyman. Yet every detail was deliberate. The ropes were not for tying bundles of wood. The tarps weren't for protecting floors from spilled paint. Beneath the concrete, Carl had carved a hidden chamber. He had reinforced the floor with steel beams, then cut and fitted a hatch flush with the ground. He built the door so carefully that it looked like nothing more than a seam in the cement, impossible to notice unless you knew exactly where to look. Carl had learned how to soundproof the walls, layer by layer, using insulation and padding designed to swallow sound. The hum of his generator, the clink of chains, the muffled cries that would have betrayed him, none of it reached beyond those walls. On the surface, it was an immaculate shed. In reality, it was a cage dressed as a workshop. His disguise stretched beyond the property. Carl maintained a pattern of normal life. He shopped at the same grocery store every Thursday, filling his cart with modest purchases, bread, canned soup, milk. He attended community gatherings, offering polite conversation and a nod of recognition to anyone who glanced his way. No one ever recalled him missing church, though he usually left early, explaining that he had projects waiting at home. This rhythm built trust, even admiration, in the eyes of people around him. He appeared predictable, reliable, the kind of neighbor you never had to worry about. The truth was far darker. The shed had already swallowed 3 lives, and Carl had managed to carry on without raising a single suspicion. His reputation was his shield. The more he blended in, the more invisible his crimes became. Every wave, every neighborly smile, every chore completed for someone else tightened the mask he wore. And behind that mask, in the quiet of his shed, Carl kept perfect order over the nightmare no one yet knew existed. The investigation into the town's string of break-ins had nothing to do with the missing people. Detectives were chasing small-time thieves who had been targeting sheds, barns, and garages, swiping tools and scrap metal to sell. Patrol cars circled neighborhoods on the outskirts, knocking on doors and asking questions. Carl Denton's property fell neatly within their route. It was only natural that they stopped by his place one warm afternoon, hoping for tips about strangers in the area. For Carl, it was a test of how well his mask could hold. He greeted the officers with a calm smile, as though he had nothing to hide. His clothes were dusty from mowing, his hands rough from work. Everything about him looked ordinary, even harmless. When they asked if they could look around, he didn't hesitate. That was his greatest weapon: cooperation. Hesitation could spark suspicion, but eagerness built trust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the key to the shed, and offered it with a casual wave, as though it meant nothing at all. The officers stepped inside, their boots echoing softly on the concrete floor. The shed smelled faintly of oil and sawdust, clean and sterile for a handyman's workshop. Rows of tools gleamed under the light, lined up with precision. The officers ran their eyes along the neat arrangement, impressed by the order. They glanced down at the ground where faint reddish streaks stained the floor. One of them pointed it out, but both quickly agreed it was nothing more than old paint or rust from tools. In a place like this, stains were expected. Neither of them imagined it was the trace of something far more sinister. As they walked through, one officer joked about how organized Carl was compared to his own garage back home. The other leaned against the workbench, tapping a hammer absent-mindedly. They talked more about the town's burglaries than about Carl, already convinced this shed had nothing to do with their case. All the while, beneath their feet, a locked steel hatch hid the remains of 3 victims. Just inches below them, silence hung heavy in a space built to keep secrets buried. Carl stood nearby, hands in his pockets, heart steady. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. If police ever came, if anyone asked to see inside, he would let them. He would smile, stay relaxed, never rush them, never flinch. And it worked. The officers saw what he wanted them to see, a tidy workspace belonging to a harmless man. They didn't notice the slight unevenness in the concrete where the hatch lay. They didn't question why every tool looked too clean, too unused. After a few minutes, the officers thanked him for his time. They left with nothing but casual conversation to report. Carl walked them to the gate, waving as they drove away, his expression unchanged. Only when the patrol car disappeared down the road did his smile fade. He turned back toward the shed, closing the door with deliberate care. The danger had passed, but the thrill of it lingered. The law had walked directly into the heart of his secret, stood inside the very place where he had killed, and walked out blind. For Carl, it was confirmation. His disguise was perfect. His shed was untouchable. It was a storm that finally began to unravel the careful order Carl Denton had built around himself. Heavy rain pounded the small town for 2 days straight, overflowing creeks and soaking fields. On the outskirts where Carl lived, water pooled against the foundations of his shed. He thought little of it at first. The structure was sturdy, sealed, and elevated just enough to keep everything inside dry. But storms have a way of stirring up what is meant to stay buried. As the ground softened and the water rushed out from under the shed, it carried something with it. Tiny scraps of fabric that had once belonged to one of his victims. A hiker, passing along the nearby tree line, spotted the cloth, twisted and caught in the mud like a flag. Curious, the hiker picked it up, assuming at first it was just litter washed down by the storm. But the fabric was torn in a way that suggested violence, and clumps of dirt clung to it as though it had been buried. Something about it felt wrong. The hiker reported it to local authorities, not knowing they were holding the first real piece of evidence tied to the town's disappearances. The fabric was tested quickly, and results confirmed what nobody wanted to believe. It belonged to Eric, the delivery driver who had vanished months earlier. The find reopened every missing person case at once. Police who had struggled for answers now had a link, a tangible connection pointing toward foul play rather than chance or choice. Suddenly, the quiet farmland on the edge of town became the center of attention. Investigators returned to Carl Denton's property, this time with a search warrant that gave them full access. Carl stood in his doorway as the squad cars pulled in, his face carefully blank. He watched as officers moved past him toward the shed. There was no smile this time, no easy offer of keys. His heart pounded, though his outward calm never cracked. Inside the shed, detectives worked more carefully than the patrolmen months earlier. They tapped along walls, opened drawers, and traced their hands along the floor. The neatness that had once charmed the casual visitor now raised questions. Everything was too clean, too staged. It was a false wall that caught their attention first. To most, it looked like an ordinary panel of wood fitted against the back of the shed. But one detective noticed the faint line where it didn't sit flush. When they pried it open, they discovered a hidden compartment. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them, filled with Carl's handwriting. What at first seemed like repair logs or shopping lists quickly revealed themselves as something far darker. Each notebook contained meticulous entries, dates, locations, descriptions of victims, and chilling diagrams of the underground chamber he had built. The discovery electrified the investigation. What had seemed like a harmless handyman's workshop was now exposed as the center of something monstrous. Still, the most important secret had not yet been revealed. The hatch in the floor, flush with concrete and invisible to the casual eye, remained locked and undisturbed. Detectives knew they had stumbled onto something big, but they had not yet seen the full scope of Carl Denton's hidden world. That revelation was waiting in the shadows below, sealed behind steel, where the truth of what had happened to the missing finally waited to be found. When investigators finally turned their attention to the floor of the shed, the air shifted. What had first appeared to be smooth concrete showed subtle irregularities under the beam of a flashlight. A faint outline, square in shape, could be traced if someone looked closely enough. The detectives pressed against it, listening for hollow echoes. Their instincts told them that the true secret of this place lay beneath their feet. After hours of work, they found a concealed latch cut into the cement and reinforced with steel. With heavy tools, they pried it open, the sound of metal against metal ringing through the silent shed. When the hatch finally lifted, it revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The stench that rose up told them immediately this was no ordinary cellar. The chamber below was cramped and suffocating, carved meticulously by Carl over years of preparation. The walls were lined with insulation to keep sound from escaping, though now it muffled only the investigators' footsteps as they entered. Chains hung from the walls, anchored firmly into the concrete. A metal chair stood in the center of the room, its legs bolted to the floor, surrounded by scattered restraints. The air was heavy with rot. In one corner, evidence bags later collected bone fragments and remnants of clothing, each piece tying back to one of the missing. The officers had suspected foul play, but the reality of what they had uncovered chilled even the most seasoned among them. Recording equipment sat on a shelf, carefully labeled and neatly stacked. Old tapes, notebooks, and photographs revealed how calculated Carl's actions had been. Nothing was random. Every victim had been studied, chosen, and tracked before being lured onto the property. The discovery painted a picture of a man who lived for control, who balanced his public kindness with secret violence. In that underground room, Carl had written his legacy in pain. Above ground, his neighbors remembered him for mowing their lawns. The contrast was almost unbearable. Word of the chamber spread quickly through the town. Crowds gathered outside police barricades, watching as evidence bags were carried out one after another. The community was stunned that officers had once stood casually inside that very shed during their earlier inspection, joking and talking, unaware they were inches above the victim's final resting place. For many, that revelation was the most haunting of all, that the truth had been right there, hidden beneath their boots, and yet they had walked away. Carl Denton was arrested without resistance. He stood quietly as handcuffs closed around his wrists, offering no excuses and showing no fear. Neighbors who once waved at him from their porches now stared in disbelief as the man they thought they knew was driven away in the back of a police car. In court, the evidence from the shed was enough to end the trial before it truly began. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of mistake. The shed was eventually torn down, the land leveled, but its memory lingered. People spoke of it in hushed tones, the way one speaks of a nightmare they wish to forget, but never can. For the town, the case became a scar, a reminder that evil can wear the face of a neighbor, can hide behind a wave and a smile, and can build horrors in plain sight. The story of the murder shed ensured that nobody would ever look at the quiet edges of town the same way again.